Good evening. US President Donald Trump has announced 10% tariff on all imports to the US after the United States Supreme Court struck down the Trump tariffs. Now, tariffs were seen as President Trump's trump card. But what does this setback mean for President Trump, for India, and the world? We decode.
It's a supreme snub for Donald Trump. As sweeping tariffs are struck down by the US SC. Trump doesn't bow down, he doubles down. Trump continues with a fresh 10% levy. From 50% to 18% to 10%, what does this mean for India? It's yet another supreme Trump tantrum. Top focus on India today.
So a major setback for Donald Trump as Supreme Court of the United States in a sharp 6-3 verdict struck down his sweeping global tariffs, ruling that the president had exceeded his authority by invoking emergency powers to impose tariffs. But Donald Trump is not the one to back down. He's already introduced a fresh 10% global tariffs. Now, with the trade deal already in the works, India is cautiously watching this very significant development. So, bags packed, Indian negotiators, the negotiations team, they now have an uphill battle to renegotiate. Would that be at 18% beyond the 150 days or at 10%? Let's find out.
It is a major blow to Trump's tariff tantrums. The Supreme Court of the United States has branded the sweeping tariffs illegal. But Trump has refused to back down and has instead announced a 10% additional tariff on all nations globally using presidential powers under Section 122.
Today, I will sign an order to impose a 10% global tariff under Section 122 over and above our normal tariffs already being charged.
Trump criticized the Supreme Court verdict, expressing deep disappointment in some of the judges and called the verdict a disgrace and unpatriotic.
The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court. They're against anything that makes America strong, healthy, and great again. They also are a, frankly, disgrace to our nation, those justices.
The Supreme Court delivered a stinging rebuke in a 6-3 decision. Snubbing the tariffs, the Supreme Court stated that Trump exceeded his authority by imposing tariffs using emergency powers. The court categorically stated that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not grant the power to the president to levy tariffs. The court added that the president requires congressional approval to enforce such tariffs. This order opens the door to refunds of billions already collected by the Trump administration. As the tussle between the US president and the Supreme Court continues, the 10% tax will remain in effect for the next 150 days, as allowed by the statute, after which it requires congressional approval. For India, that means a further relief for now from the reduced tariffs of 18% as agreed to in the trade deal. India's Commerce Ministry has put out a statement taking note of the SC verdict and the steps announced by the US administration. The ministry has asserted that it is studying these developments for their implications. The American president also asserted that the US-India trade deal remains unchanged.
Nothing changes. They'll be paying tariffs, and we will not be paying tariffs. Our deal with India is they pay tariffs. This is a reversal from what it used to be, as you know.
This major reset in international trade dynamics has triggered volatility in global stock markets. Bureau Report, India Today.
So in the US Supreme Court, Justice John Roberts, he struck down US President Donald Trump's signature tariff policy, and this was a 6-3 verdict. An angry Trump called the justices weak, a disgrace, and an embarrassment to the nation, or words to that effect. But what does the Supreme Court order mean for Donald Trump, his tariffs across the world, and especially in our context, especially for India? Joining me on this special broadcast, Siddharth Zarabi, Managing Editor, Business Today. Rohit Sharma joins us live from Washington, D.C. Ambassador Anil Trigunayat is a former top diplomat, joins us on the show. We'll be joined by other guests on this broadcast. But Siddharth, White House has just issued a clarification saying countries with trade agreements with the US, including India, will see tariff rates lowered to 10% under the latest proclamation signed by President Trump. So this 10%, is this only for the next 150 days, or are we now looking at India-US tariffs at 10%? Will we negotiate further?
What is the exact rate of tariffs after the 10% global tariff that has been imposed? We've been talking to experts here in India and trying to figure out what does it mean. The wording of the Supreme Court order and the understanding that we have developed is that it is 10% plus 3.4% average most favored nation tariff. So in effect, with this new order, India's exports to the United States are going to be on an average, weighted average, be imposed a tariff of 13.4%. Certain products, it is going to be higher. For example, shirts have a higher rate of tariffs. There are many products where exemptions are already in place. Those have not been taken away as per our understanding. There are certain products on which there are extra tariffs which will stay. So in effect, the rate is 13.5% or thereabouts. What does that mean, Gaurav? From 50% till recently, we went to 18% and we are now at 13.4%. What does that mean for India? It is advantage India. There is an additional breathing room that we have got. In fact, I can tell our viewers, Gaurav, that one of the points that we had made in the period during which there seemed to be a sort of standstill between India and US as far as our overall trade pact was concerned, we had sought a 15% rate. With this development, we are now even below that. And I would imagine that there is greater negotiating headroom now available with Indian negotiators. We are at a position where we can say it is advantage India.
Advantage India for now. What does this mean going forward? And should we relook this deal? Let me get in a word from Washington, D.C. Rohit, Trump told reporters no change in parameters. What does that mean? He said words to the effect, they, as in India, will be paying tariff and the US will not be paying any tariffs. Are we to understand that he believes we are still paying 18%, or are we paying, as Siddharth said, 10% plus MFN 3.4%, so about 13.4%?
I think President Trump was talking about the trade agreement that was announced recently, about 2 weeks ago. I think he was talking about how that trade agreement has India paying 18%. And this is not the first time he's talked about how India should be paying tariffs, that India was using or misusing tariffs. So I think he was talking about that. He did not get into details about, what we're going to be paying in the next 150 days. The question was specifically about the trade agreement. I think President Trump was speaking to that. It does give India some breathing room. But there is an Indian delegation that will be in Washington, D.C. And, as luck would have it, India would be one of the first countries that could be negotiating in these new circumstances that have arisen after the Supreme Court ruling. So it'll be an interesting watch going forward, Gaurav. But I think President Trump was talking about a trade agreement when he talked about that 18%.
Okay, Ambassador Trigunayat, where does this leave India and the trade deal? So we negotiated a deal at 18% when it was 25%. We were hoping to bring it down further to 15%. As of now, it's about 13.5%. So when we are again amongst the first of the block, our trade deal team, bags packed, waiting to go to the US, will that be negotiated at 13%, 10%, or are these just a couple of percentage points, don't matter? We'll have to see how quickly can we ink it, seal it, or should we relook it completely afresh?
Well, thank you, Gaurav. I think that, as Siddharth said, that White House also some reports have been mentioning that all the countries will now be facing the 10% tariffs that President Trump only yesterday imposed. And in addition to the MFN tariffs that have been always there. In any case, about 50% of our tariff lines have been exempt from whatever arbitrary tariffs or sanctions President Trump had imposed. So it'll be a good idea for India, and I think we'll be aiming at sealing the deal because we have had no deal at the moment. In my view, I think that irrespective of whatever is said, is the trade agreements that the White House has signed with various countries provide for various kinds of various levels or gradings of tariffs that have been imposed. I think that those tariffs will not automatically come down, nor will they be subjected essentially to the US court ruling for the simple reason because those was about arbitrary and these are negotiated tariffs between the two countries on certain items, and so they will remain intact and they will not be subjected to that. Of course, it provides a leeway and a room for further negotiation by each country.
No, but
And
if they've been
therefore, I think
negotiated at a rate higher than 13%, why should
it
India
could
go
be.
ahead with the negotiation? Because
You are
the
right, because we
circumstances
should
have
not,
changed
we have
completely.
not signed the deal as yet.
Yes,
It is only a framework agreement. So
yes.
we have a point of discussion here. And if we can bring out, and if they are saying it is 10%, then so be it. But let me tell you and caution our friends, everybody, in the policymakers and otherwise, that we have not seen the end of President Trump's tantrums. You might see him invoking other agreements also, other parts of the Trade Act like Section 301 or 232, or even going to the Congress to authorize the president to do so. Because what this Supreme Court judgment has done essentially is trying to create the primacy of the Congress over the executive.
Yes.
And therefore, it is possible that President Trump will go back and get an authorization that will be applicable and available to all the presidents, not only this one. So, since President Trump likes tariffs as his favorite tool,
Yep.
I doubt that we are seeing the end of it.
That's the favorite word in his dictionary, Sushant Sareen, because Donald Trump, when this verdict came out, he called the judges who ruled against him weak, a disgrace, and an embarrassment to the nation, or words to that effect. So, very clearly, this does indicate that he's smarting. He's speaking of this 10% tariff on all imports. He's not backing down. This is not the last we've heard of this, Sushant.
Gaurav, forget about backing down. I think he's doubling down on the tariff policy which he has initiated, and he absolutely thinks that tariffs are good. But this is a question which everybody needs to ask. There's a lot of carping sounds in India, whether we signed a good deal or we've signed a good framework agreement. The deal is still being negotiated. But personally, I think we have to decide, clearly, are tariffs good or are tariffs bad? And if tariffs are bad, why should India be levying tariffs? And if tariffs are very good, then yes, the Americans can also levy tariffs on other countries. So I think there needs to be some degree of clarity on everybody's side. Yes, tariffs are used for a variety of purposes, including some degree of protection. But the kind of protection we were giving some industries, is it justified after 30 years of economic liberalization? For example, if you're charging 150% on wines and liquors, or 150% or thereabouts on vehicles which were being imported, why should it be 100%, 150%?
So
Why
on
should
a
it?
graded basis, after the India EU deal, that's coming down in a big way.
Exactly. So we entered into a deal, and I think one thing we should thank Trump for is that many of these deals that were stuck up for so long, finally, he's kickstarted and he's focused everybody's attention to try and solve these trade matters. So I personally think that yes, if there is the negotiators should see with the Americans, if there is room for some negotiation, by all means do it. But to stand back and to stall the negotiations, to wait and see how things will, fold up or fold out in the US, I don't think that's a sensible thing to do,
Okay.
because, frankly, this is going to be a long kind of a battle. Now, assume that Trump uses some other powers to levy tariffs.
Yes.
What is the kind of that there will not be a challenge to that? And what is the guarantee that that will sail through the
So
Supreme
let
Court?
me bring in Siddharth Zarabi once again into this conversation. Siddharth, Donald Trump very clearly has told journalists in the United States, India will pay tariff, US will not pay tariffs. How do Indian negotiators now move forward? Are they looking to ink a deal as Ambassador Trigonath and Sushant Sareen pointed out? Whatever is the best possible, let's do it now. There could be worse in store, or are we looking at this entire thing afresh given the new circumstances?
Two, 3 points, Gaurav. First up, I think it is great in terms of timing for our negotiating stance. We have seen in the past that Indian negotiators have been very tough nuts to crack for the United States. We have heard it from that side as well.
Yep.
What does this 13.4% allow us to do? It allows us to enter the room for the framework agreement, which is yet to be signed. Let me just make that clear.
Yeah.
The framework agreement is under debate right now. That is going to be signed. The earlier was just a joint statement. And consequent to the framework agreement, perhaps by the year end, we will have a full fledged bilateral trade agreement. Do we need a formal trade agreement which is binding? Of course we do. Hopefully, because a bilateral trade agreement, although Donald Trump's penchant to tear up past agreements reflects the behavior of certain politicians in India, I would say. But of course, we need a bilateral trade agreement. A joint statement is just words written on paper. Third point, Gaurav, please understand what does this mean as far as the other commitments that you are alluding to. It is President Donald Trump who is saying that we will pay no tariffs. But remember, what we have in the joint statement said is we are going to look at various categories as part of a negotiating process. You recall that the US walked back with that change from commitment to buy $500 billion to intent to $500 billion.
Yes.
So I don't think there is going to be any discord. I think the Indian side will be very smart. They know that Trump has been wounded. I don't think we will try and put salt on his wounds because that is not going to work for our national interest.
Interesting. Rohit, President Trump cautioned if the US SC verdict goes against him, and he'd cautioned this earlier, there could be and would be consequences. The court so far in the matter had not weighed in on whether the federal government should provide refund to US importers who've already paid tariffs. And in 2025 alone, this has been estimated to more than $200 billion. So the road ahead may not be easy for Trump either if there is a pushback on this.
Yeah, actually, you're absolutely right, Gaurav. The Supreme Court did not talk about that. I think they've left it to the junior courts to decide that, and it would be a very very messy process as to who gets the refund. What's the timeline? How can they validate if X company gets it versus Y? So I think that's going to be very complicated. Something we will have to see how that plays out in the court of law. Again, I think President Trump knew that this could happen. I think he was hoping that Supreme Court would side with him. But I'll just go back to, earlier comment that was made on the show about getting this done through a legislation. And I think that is what is going to pick up steam in the next few months, especially given that there's a midterm in November. There was a strong backing for the Senator Lindsey Graham's bill. So we could probably see that some Democrats in the Senate, especially backing this, because again, I think it is a good talking point. And for President Trump to say, look, I wanted to do this, via legislation. We were bringing in more money, but Democrats stopped me from bringing more money to the U.S. So I think he would likely, want to go through that route, and we'll have to wait and watch how that plays out in the summer.
Ambassador Trigonath, is that also your reading that while some may want to focus on whether the US government will provide any refund to importers if $200 billion plus have already been brought into the US Treasury, President Trump will say, I was only doing this for the American people. I was bringing in more money for the American people. The Democrats stalled it. Should it not get the backing in Congress? Do you see this now become a political hot potato in the United States?
Well, I think it's quite likely that there could be a bipartisan support to this kind of a thing, because they will then frame a rule regulation under which a president can really invoke certain powers, which he called as emergency powers, which were rendered invalid by the Supreme Court. So there could be another law like that that will provide any president, for that matter, if there is an injury to the nation or to the industry. Now, in this particular case, with the revocation of his tariff, which was naturally arbitrary and misplaced, the fact remains is that industries which are protected or in the MAGA constituency will definitely feel very much chastised by that going forward, because there are likelihood of impact that will take place on the industry in the United States too. So it's some importers will benefit, exporters may benefit, but at the same time, some industries might suffer as well, which
Okay.
could be part of the MAGA constituency. So it is quite possible. But at the same time, as far as the refunds are concerned, I must say that people have to once again litigate. This will not be automatic, because
Yes.
Supreme Court has not talked about it. It's just been left open now. So everybody has to go back to the court. So it's a long process. To what extent it will materialize remains to be seen.
So let me quickly cut across to Washington, D.C. Peter Cardillo is the chief market analyst, joins us on this special broadcast. Peter Cardillo, welcome. Donald Trump, after the verdict, said, I can charge much more than I'm charging. The Supreme Court ruled that the tariff exceeded the powers given to the president by the Congress under a 1977 law to regulate commerce during national emergencies. Now, is this a huge setback for Trump, or is this something that was expected? And he's already talking about a 10% tariff to tide over this.
Well, I think first of all, we have to realize that he does have other tools in his tool shell, but they are somewhat limited. For instance, the 10% global tariffs that he imposed under Section 122 has a 90-day window. After that, it has to be approved or extended by Congress. So a lot depends on the political domestic situation, in a sense, if Congress will agree to that. He doesn't have a free hand to charge what he wants to charge, because, as I said, either other sections of the tariff bill have limits, and so I think it'll be an ongoing battle. Will he not be able to impose other tariffs? No, I think he will. But again, I think to a certain degree, this might give an upper hand to a lot of nations who haven't signed a trade deal or who have already signed a trade deal, and they may be able to come back to the bargaining table and bargain for less. Look, I think the bottom line here is that Trump is using every power that he has to continue his agenda with tariffs. Now, whether they will work at the end, it's yet to be seen. We do know that in a trade war, there are no winners.
Yes.
That's been experienced in the past. So we just have to wait and see what the total outcome is.
So before I bring in Sushant Sareen and Ambassador Trigonayat, Peter Cardillo, in President Trump's dictionary, tariff was described as the most beautiful word in his own words. He wielded the tariff weapon quite extensively. Now that the Supreme Court has struck it down 6-3, how likely is Trump, to get support in the US Congress and bipartisan support, or will he use some other clause, in your view, to push through tariffs given the pushback?
Well, it depends. It depends from the lawmakers, and it depends from Congress. The opposition party is not in favor of tariffs, that's for sure. So it's boils down to if he can keep the majority of the Republicans under his wing. And we know that there has been some defections as of recently. So I think it's going to be a tough sell to Congress. I don't think he's going to get everything he wants. I do think he will go forward with tariffs, but not at these levels. I think they will be watered down. And I've always said that he would water them down somewhere along the line.
Yes.
Of course, the decision by the Supreme Court was a blow to the administration, was a blow to his agenda, but he's not going to sit on his hands. He's a fighter. He's going to fight.
He's a fighter. He will fight. In fact, Sushant Sareen, in the dissenting opinion, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, he suggested that the federal government may be required to refund billions of dollars to importers who've already paid the IEEPA tariff. And this could potentially open the Pandora's box in the US. And that is something that President Trump or his administration would want to avoid.
Yes, look, if that matter does open up and the refunds have to take place, then it's a very wicked problem, because who are you refunding it to? Are you refunding it to the consumers who had to pay higher prices because the tariffs were levied and the companies jacked up the prices? Are you going to refund it to the companies, in which case they're making supernormal profits? Who do you refund it to? So one is that, but got to remember, in the legal fraternity, there is a concept of closed and past transactions. That okay, something has happened, we don't agree with it, that ends now. But whatever has happened in the past, you wash the slate clean. I would imagine that's the only sensible way of going about it. Otherwise, you have a litany of civil suits and cases, which how are you going to solve, and by when are you going to solve that? That is one. Second, earlier Siddharth was talking about certain commitments that were made by India or in intention to buy. We often forget that for very long, Gaurav, India and the US have been expressing the ambition that we want to take our bilateral trade to $500 billion a year, right? Where is that $500 billion is going to come from? If we are at about what, 100, and Siddharth probably will correct me, we are at about 130, 140. I'm talking about the merchandising trade right now. If you want to take it to say $500 billion, obviously we will buy more from the Americans, right? The Americans will also buy more from us. So let us imagine that you reach a situation where we are exporting, say, $300 billion and the Americans are exporting some $200 billion to us, and we are reaching that $500 billion mark in a couple of years from now. That means that you are going to be buying $500 billion worth in a matter of 2 or 3 years. So that's not such a big amount to which, there's such a brouhaha in India all about. Otherwise, we should have complained about even this figure of $500 billion, which was that ambitious target that we had set for our bilateral.
2030. By
And finally,
2030.
there is finally just one more point. There is this whole business of who is going to be paying the tariffs. Look, I don't pay tariffs if the Americans are charging tariffs on my goods. I don't like those tariffs because they affect the pricing of my goods and perhaps the demand for my goods. But the tariffs are being paid by the American consumer. To some extent, I'll cut my prices so that the fall or the price for the American consumer is moderated. But at the end of the day, any price rise because of tariffs is going to fall on the American companies and on the American consumer. So I am not paying. He can levy 500% tax for all I care. If I'm selling something which the Americans need no matter what. So, for example, if I had rare earths which I was selling to them and they levied 500% duty on it, they would still have to buy rare earths from me because there was no other source.
No, but
And we would have to pay for it.
given what we export, Siddharth, we would have lost that competitive advantage to many countries in our region. But right now, with it coming down to 10% for everyone, are we losing that competitive edge?
No, Gaurav, I don't think we should look at it that way, because you don't buy a country, you buy a product,
Product.
and you obviously buy a product that is of relevance, quality, and pricing point. But there's a larger framework issue that we also need to keep in mind. I believe, and I'm still searching for an answer for this, why did President Trump only impose 10% as the global tariff rate? Why did he not do straight away start at 20%? Two things have happened in the American economy, which also provide, in some ways, despite all the tough talk and that wild reaction from Trump and his closest advisors to the US Supreme Court, a certain kind of off ramp has been provided to this US administration, because the path that it had chosen in terms of very high tariffs was already beginning to impact the US economy. Look at the manufacturing data of the past 8 months. Look at the price rise that has happened. Lots of our friends in America tell us that things that they used to get from overseas, not just from India, have become far more expensive. For India, what does this do? I think for a period of time, this is just like the government of India choosing to bring in something through ordinance till it gets parliamentary approval. The big question will be, will President Trump go down that path, or will it now provide an impetus for the United States to have long term structured bilateral trade agreements? The reciprocal tariffs and the punitive tariffs were tools of punishment. I think now, in terms of trade, if the United States wants to reset the terms of trade with regard to goods, there is now an occasion for more structured, more rational conversations. I believe it's a positive. Even sections within the United States will see it as that. And one final point, really, Gaurav, at this stage.
Okay.
This has happened, after so many months. What it does clearly for India is that because of the pressure that the United States created, we opened up. We opened up our domestic economy. We are testing the waters with certain amount of liberalization in sensitive sectors on the fringes of our agriculture imports, for example, Gaurav. And this makes our economy and our engagement with other economies far more stronger. Don't forget the EU deal.
Yes.
Within this year, we will have 5 new trade pacts that will come into effect. And that will be much bigger in combination than just the United States.
So you're saying this is 1991 moment once again in 2026, 2.0 version, if not more. But Siddharth, let me bring in Ambassador Trigonayat. And Siddharth, you also weigh in on this. According to Global Trade Research Initiative, the GTRI analysis, they're saying that US Supreme Court order should prompt India to re-examine this entire trade deal with the US, because removal of reciprocal tariffs will now free, as Ambassador Trigonayat was also pointing out, about 50-55% of India's exports to the US from the 18% duty. Which means, do they come down, Siddharth, only to the 3.4% MFN? And is that the advantage that we should be looking at? Siddharth?
I think what the GTRI is saying is what our other guests are also talking about,
Yes.
which is, what do we now negotiate with the United States? Was this going to be a negotiation on the tariff rate? No, that had already been settled in the joint statement.
At 18%.
18% now becomes 13.4%. The negotiation and the argument, if at all, if any, will be on the give and take that is implicit in such a negotiation. And I don't think we should confuse the resetting of the rate with the critical sensitive points towards that journey for a bilateral trade agreement.
Okay.
From what I understand, and knowing our negotiators, knowing Prime Minister Modi's stance, Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal's approach, Commerce Secretary's approach, the rest of the team, they are not going to be swayed by 18 becoming 13.4%. There's a far more medium and long-term outlook that we are working with, and it will be in our interest to have a good deal, just as we have done with so many other economies across the world.
Is that also your reading, Ambassador Trigonayat, before I bring in Peter Cardillo for his final comments on this?
Yes, I think so. That what Siddharth has said is absolutely right, and what has been said by others as well. The fact remains is the good deal, a structured deal in which there is certain predictability, even if for a short time. Because with President Trump, frankly, you don't know when he will renege on a particular deal or he doesn't like something. So that's there. But as long as we have some kind of a structured arrangement, it is always good. And I think this would be the way our team or negotiators will be looking at it. If it goes down, well and good. I mean, 13.4 or 5% is pretty good for us. But then if 10% is universal, and if it is not going to be different countries having different, so you have to raise your competitive advantage as well as continue to diversify our trading partners. I mean, that is something we have learned, and I think what President Trump has done to India in the process in many other countries, but especially to us, should be an eye opener for us. And I think it was a blessing in disguise for us.
It indeed was, and the number of trade deals that India has already inked and is in the process of inking goes on to indicate that the world actually is now realigning, Rohit, isn't it? There's a reset that's happening. Canada, India, Europe, India, Australia, India, Japan, India. So many bilateral agreements in the works, so many multilateral agreements in the work. Almost everyone seems to be Trump-proofing themselves.
Yes, I mean, look, one of the things that President Trump said last year when Prime Minister Modi was in Washington, D.C., is that he wanted everybody to get along with everybody. He wanted India to get along with China. He wanted China to get along with the U.S. He wanted Russia to get along with the U.S. So I think in a way he's made it happen. Maybe people are not appreciating the way it's been done, but I think he's definitely hit the reset button. To Siddharth's earlier point, and I just wanted to make a little
Sure.
context about it. He said, there's a reason why President Trump has not put it at 20%. These new global tariffs. Well, the Section 122 only allows him to go up until 15%. So one of the reasons why he's not extended it to up to 20% is because that limits his authority. He can only do 15% ceiling. That's the ceiling, and then you add the MFN tariffs, which is essentially 13.5. So he could not have gone beyond 10%. So that was advised to him by his advisors, and he had to
Okay.
stick to it. And also following the law, that he has to by the Supreme Court ruling. So that's important. And third, Gaurav, I think we have not seen the end of this. I think President Trump ran on this. He wants tariffs. He's seen how tariffs could work. So he will find a way to make this an important weapon in this administration.
Okay. Peter Cardillo, Trump said post verdict, and I'm quoting him here, "It's my opinion that the court has been swayed by foreign interests and a political movement that is far smaller than people would think." In your view, some of the guests on the show had this apprehension: what if Trump goes back on whatever he signed on today? With Trump, it depends, as some argue, what side of the bed he gets out from. So is there an apprehension, whatever you may ink, it may be very temporary?
Well, I think I agree with your previous guest, and I think that at the end there will be trade agreements, but not trade agreements that will excessively lead to higher inflation here in the United States. And I think the Trump administration knows that, although they've been saying that inflation is not, that tariffs are not inflationary. They are.
Okay.
If you come to the United States, you can experience the inflation effect of the tariffs. But the truth of the matter is, I think that at the end, we're probably looking somewhere between 5 and maybe 7% of tariffs that were a little bit that are higher that they were previously imposed before the Trump administration. And I think that that's the aim. I think, as I said before, President Trump is a fighter, and he's going to fight.
Okay.
And so he's not going to do away. He will do everything in his power to keep tariffs, but at a much less percentage rate, so that it doesn't have a very negative inflationary effect here in the States.
We'll be tracking that story very, very closely, but he did shock India and the world when he came initially with 25% and then another 25% on India for buying Russian oil. So from 50%, it came down to 18%. And now, for the moment, it stands at 10% plus 3.4% MFN. So about 13.4%. Will it go down further? We'll be tracking that story very closely. I want to thank all my guests. That is all I have time for on this part of the show.